Right, I'd like to thank the organizers who included me in this distinguished panel. Although I'm not an expert on the UAE, but perhaps what I can say have some resonance elsewhere in the region, not only in the Arabian Peninsula. I would like to just concentrate in the limited time I have on a couple of points. First, look at the internal dynamics of what I call Arab repressive regimes, and that includes the monarchies and the republics. Then move on to talk about the regional issues, which include Saudi Arabia and its neighboring countries. And if I have time, I will move on to consider the international situation and connections that are being drawn and redrawn at the moment as a result of the Arab Spring. So basically, if I'm going to concentrate on the political and social aspects of this Arab repressive regimes that have been entrenched in the 20th century mostly, and it coincided with the emergence of the post-colonial national or nation state. This regime was put in place on the background of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, where the various provinces of the Ottoman Empire became so-called nation states, with the exception of only probably 3 or 4 countries that had an experience of a state, such as, for example, Morocco, Egypt, Yemen, and Oman. We can say that the rest of the Arab world had actually emerged at that historical moment after the First World War under the auspices of imperial powers, at the time Britain and France, and later on that rivalry came to an end after the Second World War and the United States moved on. The region entered into this fierce struggle between 2 superpowers at the time, the USA and the West and the Soviet Union. The system collapsed, and I think 1979 was extremely important as a critical year in redrawing the international competition over the Arab world. So this Arab world had been hostage to this kind of struggle between superpowers, initially 2, France and Britain, then Russia, the Soviets, and the Americans. And from 1979, we find that the whole region became drawn into the American sphere of influence without real competition. Now it's changing with the Arab Spring, and I will come to that. But let me look at this Arab political order that was becoming more and more entrenched. And I think the critical moment happened after 1967, and that is, it coincided with the, what the Arabs call a Nakba, and that is the Arab defeat in the Palestinian-Israeli and Arab-Israeli war, whereby we begin to see a kind of regime that was increasingly becoming authoritarian and repressive. And it had a kind of specific characteristics to it that made it survive and at the same time make authoritarianism more entrenched. Let me look at the characteristics, the political characteristics. And here I'm talking about republics, the type of Mubarak regime, and monarchies like Saudi Arabia, and even the small statelets of the Gulf or the Emirates, like the Kuwaiti and Omani and sultanates, etc. The first characteristic was related to the extended familial dynastic rule. The Arab system wasn't an absolute leadership. We begin to see that this so-called leadership consisted of familial extended kinship solidarities. And these began to look like dynasties rather than an absolute centralized monarchy or presidential system, in the sense that family members, cousins, brothers, whether you are talking about Mubarak or Ben Ali or the Saudi king, they all ruled as a group. And this situation created some kind of tension within the system. Because these ruling groups, families, whether they are kings or presidents, began to grow, and therefore they had to create more jobs for them and distribute the state amongst themselves in such a way as to please all the members of the presidential or royal family. And at the same time, you have dissidents within the royal families or the presidential. So the king of Morocco has his cousin who's called the Amir al-Ahmar, the Red Prince. And the Saudi king has his brother who's another constitutional Emir. And then you have the UAE with some groups, and we heard recently about what was going on in the UAE, and I'll leave this to Chris to talk about. And the same thing within Kuwait, the same thing with Bashar, al-Assad family, so there's always Rifat somewhere claiming his share. But the whole system was beginning to be stabilized as long as there is money to go around and divide the cake amongst themselves with complete disenfranchisement of the population. The second characteristic is the marginalization of state institutions. Here, each state thrived in creating institutions from the Committee for Fighting Corruption to human rights organization to parliaments to judiciary to educational institutions to think tanks. So there is this explosion in state institution, but without substance. These were ridden with corruption, nepotism, etc. Then there's the most important aspect of a functioning state, and that is the manipulation of legislative institutions and bodies. So the judiciary was completely sidelined. It became an arm of the Ministry of Interior in Egypt, in Morocco, in other places. Whatever the president and the king and their cronies wanted, they could actually install a kind of, bring about a kind of resolution, a judgment that would suit that. So in places where there is emergency law, such as in Egypt, in Algeria until recently, and in the monarchies, it was an emergency situation, but without passing a law. And therefore, it was the status quo. This is how people lived. Fourth, there is the cooptation of the judging, of the judiciary. That was extremely important. Judges lost their aura, and it is very ironic that the judge in Islamic history was somebody who is actually, who carries weight, who had to maintain his independence and distance from the ruling group. But under this authoritarian repressive regime, the judges lost all their respect and became basically a functioning bureaucracy, completely allied to the regime. And by creating more religious institutions such as the Hajj, the pilgrimage affairs, the Ministry of Awqaf, endowment, it was basically a way of controlling religion and restricting the ability of the people to maneuver, to choose a different interpretation, to issue a new fatwa. So there is a heavily centralized kind of situation that made religion yet another arm of the state. Fifth, there's the restriction on the public sphere. With oil money, with competition between different oil-producing countries, we find that the public sphere, the media, especially the media, television production, TV serials, even historical programs on television during Ramadan, all that became the public sphere of the state. And as much as we have multiple actors within this presidential or monarchical rule, we find multiplicity of media. So a Saudi prince would, for example, sponsor a Rotana type of television where video clips, very westernized kind of media is projected. And at the same time, he would sponsor a religious channel that specializes in so-called moderate Islam. And you find another prince doing exactly the same. So the multiple princes, because of the availability of multiple funds, were able to create contradictory public sphere where everybody was at war with everybody else. And wars between Arab regimes were fought actually in the media. I mean, forget about the Arab League and the GCC when they go and kiss each other and shake hands and have the incense sort of almost clouding the atmosphere. You find the battles were fought in the media, in the public sphere. And this made it very difficult for old political parties, for a new youth generation to be able to find a space. But with a miracle, the internet arrived. By 2000, most of the Arab world was connected, but obviously there were multiple restrictions on this media. Even then, all Arab presidents and monarchs had to go to Tunis to design ways of controlling the internet. And of course, under the patronage of Ben Ali, who welcomed them, they were designing ways of controlling the youth access to this new space that was created. And some countries with multiple funds were able to purchase technology to control the media. Saudi Arabia created an institution called the Science and Technology Institution, the purpose of which is to control the media and enforce censorship. Now, the Saudis obviously say that this is done to protect our morality as Saudis. By the way, I'm Saudi. And therefore, they are protecting us from Western pornographic material. But in fact, everything that is political, controversial, from Amnesty International website to my books are banned. So anyway, this public sphere became very volatile with contradictory images, the purpose of which is to protect their regimes. But obviously, because there are multiple regimes, they were fighting their battles on airwaves. So, for example, at a time when Qatar was having bad relations with Saudi Arabia, Al Jazeera would be attacking the Saudis by inviting the opposition. And at the same time, Al Arabiya would highlight stories about Qatar that undermine Qatar. And the story goes on and on and on. And they all fought, Al Jazeera fought Mubarak on television because Qatar was upset with him. And the idea that we have multiple media in the Arab world, and this is good, is very unrealistic because, yes, it opened the sphere to multiple voices, but at the same time, it was sponsored by governments, it was under the control of these regimes, and there was no way that the truth could actually emerge out of this mess. Now, at the social level, what was happening to Arab society, to Saudi Arabia itself? We find, again, around 4 characteristics that I can identify. The first one is persistent primordial identities, and by which I mean identities around tribe and ethnicity. So the Arab world was against this veneer of Arab nationalism or the Islamic Ummah. On the ground, people were boiling with their tribal identities, with their ethnicities. In the Maghreb, they have the Amazigh, the Berber issue. In the Near East, we have the Kurdish issue. We have the people who are stateless. We have a multiple sort of, and the tribal element. The tribal element is extremely relevant to the Arabian Peninsula, but also to other areas. Now, the common wisdom would tell us, and this is shared by some kind of Orientalist interpretations and by the local people, that we are all tribal from time immemorial. We will never become anything else. The idea of citizenship or nationalism is beyond us. But I think I'm not debating that. Yes, we are all tribal. I have my own tribe, and I'm sure some people in this room have their own tribes. But as an anthropologist, I'm interested to find out why these tribal identities or ethnicities have survived. First, there's the colonial legacy, but I don't want to blame it on the colonialist, which is really a superfluous argument. I want to consider the way these repressive regimes used the tribal element in order to divide and rule. It's a continuation of the old story. The Middle East, unlike Europe, probably Europe before the Second World War, has always been a mosaic of tribal groups, of ethnicities, of languages. If you are in Lebanon in the 1950s, you would hear Armenian, Arabic, you would hear Syriac, you would hear Kurdish, and Iraq is another example. So the story of the nation state has been very troubled, and repressive regimes played on these divisions. Then we have persistent sectarianism. And here, the Sunni-Shia divide, which has become endemic today. Sectarianism, everybody tells us that you have always been Shia divided along Sunni-Shia lines. Yes, of course, and I don't know of any society that doesn't have religious differences. All human societies have them. But what do we make out of them, and why they have persisted? Obviously, they have persisted because there are two countries with great resources that have mobilized people along these lines, the dividing line between Sunni and Shia. And these two countries are Saudi Arabia and Iran. And since 1979, the hype of sectarianism have increased in the region. Didn't help that Iraq was thought and imagined by the Americans as a sectarian entity. Shia opposition in London and its own intellectuals talked about their oppression as Shia, not as Iraqis. The Americans got the idea and they institutionalized it in Iraq itself. So after Lebanon, which is the sectarian state par excellence, we have the Iraqi model now as yet another one. And possibly we will see more in Syria and even Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the rest of them, Yemen, etc. The third point is the persistent gender inequality. Obviously, Arab kings and president promoted themselves as gender reformists, and their wives played an important role. And therefore, I heard a banal expression, actually read an article by a Western journalist that these secular dictators are better for women than the Islamists who are going to come and get the... Why? Secular dictators wanted to appeal to an international constituency. They make news. Mubarak's Susanna's law, or the Moroccan Mudawwana of the personal law, makes big news among Western journalists. And look at this monarch, a Muslim monarch who is moderate and improving the status of women. Look at the Saudi king, allowed women to vote in half municipal elections, and they're allowed to participate, to be appointed to the Shura Council. And these are great reformers, unlike the others, Ikhwan, Salafi, etc. So they make international news, and they give a beautiful face to these dictators. Then there's the ideological cleavages that are promoted by these repressive regimes, and that is to divide the population. You are Salafi Tablighi, you are Salafi Jihadi, you are Ikhwani, Muslim Brotherhood, and you are a liberal. And therefore, as long as these cleavages are there, promoted, and the government would sponsor most of them, not only one group. So the Saudi government would have a liberal, so-called liberal, I wouldn't like to call it liberal, but so-called a press that attacks religious scholars, and at the same time there are newspapers sponsored by the state that attacks the liberals. So therefore there's a war of all against all. Now, what has the Arab Spring done to all this? It's just created chaos, basically, in this status quo of Arab repression. Let me just talk about the GCC and leave the Arab League, as it's probably going to go down the drain soon.
And because we have about 30 seconds for the GCC.
The GCC claims unity against diversity, conflict, and competition. So I'm not impressed by the meetings they have all over the place. There is a unity to preserve repressive monarchy at the level of leadership. They're all married into each other. They all have connections. I give you my sister, you give me your cousin, and we like to go hunting together. So there is that element of personalized rather than institutionalized relationship between Gulf monarchies. But believe me, they have their own problems. And I will go into some of the problems later. There is a common theme, and Bahrain created that moment of threat, that we have to preserve our chairs, and we can't actually risk one of us losing his position, which was Al-Khalifa in Bahrain, and therefore they all summoned themselves to help him and put him in place. Now, what do they fear as well? They fear two things as far as the domino effect. We have all the figures, the economic statistics, that we are great, we can distribute money, we have great funds, oil is never going to run out soon. But there are two social, political trends that they are scared of. They're not scared of jihadi violence. That doesn't scare them. In fact, quite a lot of that violence was related to the states, especially Saudi Arabia. If not in direct sponsorship during the Afghan war, indirectly later on. It is their arm of foreign policy now on the ground. And sometimes they get together, but it's almost like, if you're so close to a dictator, you are bound to be burnt by him. If you come too close to that center of power, you are burnt by him. And the jihadis, the Al-Qaeda, were too close to the regime, and they were burnt by the regime, because still the regime is stronger than them. But it doesn't bother them that much. And some countries never, ever had any kind of terrorism on its territory. Who do they fear? They fear two Islamist trends. Secular leftists, they don't bother with that. First, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the second, the Salafis that are willing to engage with democratic process. Now, this might seem a contradiction, but we do have certain Salafis in the Gulf region who are actually trying to promote that. And one of them is in Kuwait, is a wide trend that is trying to engage with democracy. And also there is one in Saudi Arabia. But these are dangerous for the regimes who claim that they are ruling according to God's law and the Quran and the Sunnah. The second trend is the Muslim Brotherhood. We've seen the antagonism that Saudi Arabia had with Tunisia and more recently in Egypt. And they will do everything in their, within their means in order to create more chaos in those countries where the Islamists have won. Exactly the same strategy that they used in Algeria in the 1990s, in Gaza, in the Palestinian territory, when Hamas got into power, won the elections, and the problem will continue. One thing for Saudi Arabia that is extremely important, Saudi Arabia lived on the myth that it is the only Islamic country in the Arab world. Mubarak, Gaddafi, Nasser before him, all of them were infidels. And the Saudi ulama passed fatwas which excommunicated them. Excommunication is not the right word, but it is takfir, which, because excommunication is specifically Christian, well, there is no church in Islam to excommunicate people from, but it means that they are no longer Muslims. And therefore, the Saudi ruling family claims that it is the only true, authentic Islamic country. Now, if the Muslim Brotherhood could do Islam and democracy, could combine the two, and even its own Salafis are building bridges with global discourse on justice, shura, consultation, and political participation, that is the real threat. And only yesterday, one of those figures in Saudi Arabia, Abdullah al-Hamid, he was interrogated. He's been in and out of prison for the last 20 years, and he was interrogated, and the accusations reflect these kind of worries.